Well, hello, everybody. We're so excited you could join us here today for this live signing with Premier, and we're really delighted to spend some time with you today. I'm really excited to be with somebody who's not only my boss, I served as Betsy's chief of staff. Well, she was the 11th United States Secretary of Education, but someone I also count as a friend, and that's Betsy DeVos. And we're excited to be with you, and we're excited to talk about this great new book that Betsy has written, Hostages No More, The Fight for Education, Freedom, and the Future of the American Child. We're so grateful for your interest in this book and really for your interest in America's kids, which is what we're here to talk about today, is what this book is about and what Betsy has fought really her entire life for, which is to improve education in this country, to make sure that every kid has an equal opportunity to get a truly world-class education and unlock everything that the future might hold in store for them. So, Betsy, let me allow you to say a few words and welcome everybody to the call.
Well, thanks so much, Nate. Thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks for being here with me today. I'm excited to join all of you to talk about the book and to answer your questions. Maybe just a little bit about why I wrote the book in the first place. I didn't set out to write a book, but I think our last 2 years' experience with the education system, the K-12 system in our country, really has laid bare many of the failings of the system that I have long recognized and long worked to try to overcome and give parents and families and kids the power to find their right fit for education. So this is really an effort to talk about how we can fix the K-12 learning experience, how kids actually navigate their K-12 years. And it's filled with stories about experiences that I've had over the years. And then importantly, a lot of ways and tools that families can use to really force change, to encourage change, to change things up so that they parents and students can really realize their full potential. And I think it's going to help advance the conversation about what we need to do to really make a systemic change for education.
And I think that's so important right now. Because as a parent myself, but for the parents I know you meet across the country, everyone, for some reason or another, has been upset about what's been happening with their kids' schools or their kids' education over the last years. And I wonder, maybe you can talk a little bit about that. You obviously had a front row seat to what happened as we came into the coronavirus crisis, the sudden closing of every school in America, something we've never seen before, and then what transpired over the 2 years that followed.
Sure. Well, first of all, parents had a front row seat to see what was happening when the schools were closed down. And in many cases, they were very, very disappointed with how the schools handled a crisis. And after the first couple of weeks, instead of really leaning in and trying to figure out solutions, many locations, many systems really just sort of sat on their hands and left kids and families high and dry. And so today we see learning losses that are still really immeasurable, the depth of which we won't know for years. We know kids have had increasing mental health issues as a result. So all of the lengthy and extended shutdowns, the various mandates, be it around wearing masks, not wearing masks, having vaccines, not having vaccines, all of the discussion around that. And then many parents saw firsthand and up close their children's curriculum. And in many cases, they were very, very unhappy with what they saw, whether it was a lack of high expectation and robustness, or whether it was really curriculum that was antithetical to their values. It was really a range of things. And so this has really focused many families in on their kids' K-12 experience like they have never been before.
And it seems to me, and I think for so many other people, that just sounds like common sense, right? We want our kids as parents raised up in a way that makes sense to us, in a way that matches our values, in a way that matches our aspirations for our kids and for the future generation. And I know there are a lot of questions. We're seeing a lot of questions coming in. We're excited to answer all of your questions. This will be the last one I'll ask, Betsy. Talk about why you think this has become so divisive in this country. There are people, critics of yours, who blame you for that, but I think there's probably something deeper at play here in terms of why we can't just let families and parents do what's best for their own kids.
Well, there are very powerful forces that have long controlled the system. Our government run public education system is at its core controlled by school unions. And we call them teachers unions generally. I broaden it to call it school unions because it includes many more members other than teachers, and all of their allies. Both of us working in Washington, we got to know all of the alphabet soup of groups up close and personal. And they all have a vested interest in not only protecting the system, but continuing to grow and consolidate more and more power around the system. And it's all focused on adult issues, not on what's best for kids. And so this has been the impediment and the big roadblock to systemic change. But we're seeing now, again, families have awakened and parents are raising their voices like never before. So it really is an ideal time to push for policy change at the federal level, but also importantly at the state level.
Yeah. And I think it's so important. It's so fitting. It's one of the things that you're asking here right now is tell us about this great new book you've written, Betsy, and specifically about its title. You're talking about what seems like hostages. Maybe you can explain how you came to name the book Hostages No More.
Absolutely. Well, it's an admittedly provocative title, but it is a direct reference to a quote by Horace Mann. Horace Mann is commonly known as the father of our K-12 system. When it was founded 175 odd years ago, Horace Mann said at the time that educators are entitled to look upon parents as having given hostages to our cause. So our cause then may have had some laudable goals, but we've also seen in recent history that children have been held hostage to a system that for too many of them is not serving them well. And so that's the reason for the title. The argument that children should no longer be held hostage to a system that is self-serving, not serving kids.
Absolutely. That's right. Let me go to the questions from you all. And thanks again so much for joining this live stream here with Betsy DeVos, national best-selling author of Hostages No More, the 11th United States Secretary of Education. Betsy, Tom from Texas is curious, what's the biggest takeaway you want the readers to gain from reading Hostages No More?
Well, I would love for the readers to gain an understanding of what power they have to really help change the experience for their children, their grandchildren, their neighbors, their friends, and what tools they have right at their fingertips to help facilitate these changes, be it working with their local legislators to advance policy that's going to empower families and empower kids, or other ways that they can get involved, be it through school boards or starting a school themselves, or helping empower teachers who want to do something different. And there's lots of great stories in the book about schools that are doing things differently, that are meeting kids' needs in a different way. And I think it can be an inspiration as to what could be for many kids.
I wonder if you can build on that, Betsy. We're seeing some questions coming in from Facebook. Thanks for those of you on Facebook who are joining, about how your vision of education freedom could impact teachers and what that could mean for them. And
absolutely,
talk about that.
Yes, absolutely. And there are so many great teachers that have been part of a system that many of whom have become frustrated because of how their system responded during the pandemic, or even before that. An education freedom environment could really help them to find the niche that's going to really inspire and ignite their passions for teaching and for learning and for helping kids learn. And I think about hearing stories from many families who really had to take things in their own hands during the pandemic, and started whether it's a homeschool consortium or a small one-room type schoolhouse, or learning pods, or micro schools. And there's so many different creative solutions that people want to be able to access and continue to grow and to help facilitate for others. teachers in that environment are going to have the world open to them. They should be the most valued part of that equation. And so for teachers, education freedom would be a huge, huge boon for their profession.
So let's finish out. I've heard you sometimes talk about it as a tripod, right? That education is the parent, the teacher, the student. We talked a little bit about the student. We talked a little bit about the teacher. Let's talk about parents. And Kathy from Indiana is curious. How important do you think it is for the parent to be involved and informed in both their child's school, but also importantly, and you touched on this, the curriculum that their child's being taught?
Well, I think it's critically important. And I think, again, parents have really realized this in the last year when they've seen firsthand some of the curriculum that their children have been taught. And whether it's been, wokeism or critical race theory or sexualized content for very young children, many parents have been very, very disappointed and in many cases rightfully angered by what their kids have been exposed to. And at the same time, many of their children are not learning the things that they need, the tools that they need to be able to survive and thrive in the future. They're not learning to read and write and do their arithmetic and, the basics of learning. Many parents and many families want their children to get back to the basics of learning what they need for the future.
Yeah, that's so true. Let me go back to the beginning here. And Stacy from North Carolina has an interesting question. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Betsy. How did you get started in caring so much about education and then leading to becoming the Secretary of Education?
Yes, so my interest in education started when my oldest son, Dick and I have 4 children, and my oldest son was going to start kindergarten. And we knew we were going to be able to have our son go to whatever school we thought was best for him because we had the resources to be able to ensure that. I looked around West Michigan where we live, and I discovered a really awesome little faith-based school in the core of our city, Grand Rapids. And I got involved there. We didn't end up having Rick attend there, but I got involved with this school, the Potter's House School, as a volunteer. And the more I volunteered there, the more I realized that for every family that had children there were probably 10 or 20 other families in the neighborhood that would have loved to have their children go to a school like the Potter's House. But it simply wasn't possible because they couldn't afford it. The families there couldn't afford it. All of the resources to run the school had to be raised from benefactors in the community. And the more I got involved, the more I thought, this is just not right. It's not fair. It's not fair that I can make this decision for my kids. And all this money is being spent on these other children's education, but their parents have no say in where they actually get that education. And so I began to get involved in policy change, and that has been the case for now 35 years.
Great. Well, for those of you just tuning in, just want to remind you, we're here with Betsy DeVos, the 11th Secretary of Education, national best-selling author. Congratulations. Hostages No More. And we're signing live copies of this book for you now. So if you're interested in getting a signed copy of Hostages No More, learning about how you can help advance educational options in this country, maybe help your own kids, your grandkids, nieces, nephews, others in your community, have a better education to set them up for success, you can go right now to premiercollectibles.com/hostages, premiercollectibles.com/hostages. Order a copy that Betsy will sign. We have a stack of books right here on the table. She'll be signing them today. You've spent most of the last months signing books, it seems like, across the country,
and I enjoy it.
Also being able to share really, I think, a message of hope ultimately about how we can go, and this leads into the next question, how we can go from an education system that we know tragically, not just through COVID, but really for the last decades, has failed altogether too many kids, right, to an environment, to a land of opportunity where every kid can unlock that. And so the question is, and it's from Greg in Ohio, what advice do you have for a family who wants to do something better for their kid, but really at this moment doesn't have the means to do anything but send them to their public or their government school?
Well, Greg, I know that Ohio has advanced programs to help free kids to find that right fit. I don't know if your family would qualify for the programs today, but I urge and encourage you to get involved with speaking to your state legislators about advancing bolder, broader policies that would actually support this for your children. I like to use the metaphor of a backpack. Kids go to school every day with the stuff they need in their backpacks, right? Well, metaphorically, we should be attaching all of the resources that are already being invested to educate your child or your children, already being spent by the state. And that metaphorically should be attached to your child's backpack to find that right place for your kid and find that right setting, find that right experience. And I know that there are good legislators in Ohio that are really working to do this. They need more encouragement. And I just hope that you will get together with some of your friends and neighbors and help make your voices heard around that and make it happen for your kids.
A couple of related questions here, Betsy. Blaine in Virginia and Shannon in Iowa, both curious. What is the big threat of school choice? Why are people against it? And what do you think would happen if parents lost that freedom in places where they have it to make a choice for their child?
Well, the only threat for education freedom or about education freedom is that it does take away the monopolistic control that the government-run teacher union and their allies controlled system currently operates under. And this is the case in many states across the country. There are quite a few states that have advanced some education freedom policies. And chief among them, I often cite Florida as the most advanced in this regard. But importantly, Arizona just has joined the ranks in the last few weeks and is now going to be offering universal education savings account scholarships to any family that chooses to send their child to another school or another education setting than they're assigned one. The threat is that it takes power away from the system, but it empowers families. And so that is the reward. That is the goal. That is where we should be oriented. Education is about individual kids. It should not be about systems and buildings. It should be about supporting children and each of their pursuits for their education.
I wonder, Betsy, if you can just expand a little bit on this. And I know this is something you talk about at length in the book, Hostages No More, but help a reader or a listener with us here today understand, what would that look like if we funded students, not systems? What might a student's educational day look like versus what their experience is today going to a school building, sitting in a desk?
Well, I think it's really hard for any of us to fully appreciate what it could look like in a few years, because what it could look like is so customized for each child that if you have 3 or 4 children, each of your children's education experience might look completely different. But let's say you have a really ambitious middle schooler that is really interested in one specific subject area. Perhaps in the morning, she is doing a virtual class with an instructor on the other side of the world on that particular subject. And then perhaps a little later in the morning, she's going and meeting up with some of her other classmates and friends and neighbors and attending a couple of classes at a local charter school. Then perhaps in the afternoon, she is getting her basics around arithmetic or math and some of her science basics at yet another location. There's really no end to the way a child could ultimately learn and get all of what they need to be able to thrive as an adult. We've lived under this system of K-12 education for 175 years. It's basically unchanged from the time it was founded. We measure the amount of seat time, number of days in the classroom. We orient the desks, the teachers up in the front, and it's very much the traditional model that probably all of us on this call today grew up with experiencing. But the reality is the rest of the world has changed so significantly. And education is really the least disrupted industry in our country. And it is an industry. We spend $750 billion a year on K-12 education in America. And yet the results for kids have continued to diminish and decline in spite of the billions and trillions of dollars that we're investing in education. We have got to do something different for kids and for their futures individually. And collectively, we need to do something different if we want to continue to thrive and lead the world as a nation. And I have such great hope for and optimism about the ingenuity and creativity and entrepreneurship resident in our country and in citizens in our country, and what that will mean when families are really freed up and when there are countless consumers that can make choices, just like we make choices in other areas of life, what that will mean and what that will look like for a child's K-12 education experience.
There's so many, I think, interesting and surprising things that you share in this book, Hostages No More, Betsy. You just touched on two of them I'd love to dig deeper into, because I don't know that a lot of the folks listening or a lot of the folks around the country know much about this. You just threw out a pretty significant number in terms of what we spend on education in this country. And I think a lot of people have long believed or long been told that the problems in education are that we underfund or underinvest in education. But at $750 billion a year, talk about what that means on a per student basis and what we're spending versus what the rest of the world spends.
Sure. Well, on a per student basis, on average across the country, we spend about $15,000 per year per child. And there's some places that spend significantly more and other places significantly less. It really does depend on what state you're in and what area of your state. But as compared to the rest of the world, we spend the most, with the exception of two small nation states, and the most by about 30%. And yet we are 13th in reading, 18th in math, and 18th in science, and 37th in math as compared to the rest of the world. And so we're not getting the results that we need. And when you think about that on the individual child basis, individual kids are not getting what they need. And that's what my focus has been. We need to be focused on each child because they're each unique and different. They learn differently. I said before I had 4 kids, and I think about the very different ways that they learn, the different things they're interested in. Now 10 grandchildren, and all very different as well. And what tweaks the interest of one of them may be totally uninteresting to someone else. And so again, creativity and entrepreneurship have to be interjected into the K-12 learning experience. When that happens, it's going to unleash a whole new menu of options and opportunities for kids.
Speaking of misperceptions, we just got an interesting question on Facebook. Thanks again to everybody who's tuning into this live stream about something I think a lot of people don't understand about a school of choice system, an education freedom system. And this gentleman asks, well, what if I like the school that my kids go to today? What do I do then? And maybe you can explain how in your system of education freedom, if you will, how that would work for a family.
Certainly. Well, in a system of education freedom, you would have the freedom to continue to choose the school to which your child is assigned. Nobody would force you to do something different or go somewhere different. And the follow-up question often comes, well, what about if a lot of kids leave the school and, the school is smaller? Well, first of all, the school will make adjustments. But I like to cite Florida because Florida is the most advanced in terms of the length of time and the breadth of choices that have been afforded families and students in Florida. They've continued to build on the really good work of then Governor Jeb Bush more than 20 years ago now. And in Florida, there have been a number of rigorous studies done to look at what happens in districts where a high percentage of children are going to schools other than their assigned school. And what happens is the kids that have stayed in the school that they're zoned for, their achievement levels have continued to rise. And there's a couple of reasons for this. I'm quite certain. First of all, the kids for whom the school wasn't working have found a different one, presumably that's working better for them. And then for those kids that are in that school that they stayed in, the school leadership has undoubtedly made changes and adjustments as they've seen other children leave. They have probably done things and changed things that before they were unwilling to do or unwilling to even consider, as they have other things to benchmark, or other examples to benchmark themselves against. So it's a win-win for everyone. And if your school is working for your child, that's great.
It's so great. And I think so encouraging for so many folks to know that in an education freedom environment, freedom really is the operative word.
That's right.
Parents, families, students, teachers, everyone would be free to make the decision that made the most sense for them.
Exactly.
As opposed to what we have today, where no one, except those with financial means, really have the freedom to pick a different choice. I'm curious, another interesting question just coming in now, Betsy, and it brought me back to something you write about in Hostages No More. And it's about the calendar in our schools, right? We've come to accept this idea of school starting early, getting out mid-afternoon, taking the summer off. And the question coming in is, how could education freedom work for parents whose work schedules don't match the school schedule that we've all become so acclimated to?
Really great question. And in an education freedom environment, there would undoubtedly be schools and education settings that would get that and would cater to families that perhaps had long commutes in the beginning and the end of the day, and would work to ensure that the children they are serving could be there and stay there for the day. Perhaps they'd work with local community organizations to bring in some of the after school services and programs and so forth, and wrap that into the experience of the day. Again, no limit to the creativity that could be deployed in an education freedom environment. And when parents and families become the consumer that can make decisions, the response to that will be to meet those needs, to meet those demands, to meet those desires.
And I think that could be so transformative, right? When we think about schools and education environments rising to meet the needs of those they serve, instead of families having to try to figure out how to work around the school environment, you might change the entire trajectory of a family's life in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And another way to approach it, and one that I think would work well for many students, is really to go with a mastery approach, where instead of measuring time by the hours spent in a seat behind a desk, you measure and see, judge by how a child learns and masters a concept and is able to demonstrate that they've learned that material. Then they can move on. If they do it quickly, they can move on quickly. If it takes them a little longer in one subject area, they can take the time necessary. But measuring achievement by the mastery of material versus amount of time spent in a seat. I mean, you think about the number of kids who end up all the way through their K-12 experience and yet are still very poor readers, if they even could be judged to be readers. And there's really no excuse for this to begin with. But secondly, if you were moving on a mastery model, you would not ever allow that child to continue to go to a place where they had to know how to read in order to understand the next piece of learning around language arts. You would make sure they took the time necessary to master the ability to read and comprehend, and then move on to the next phase.
And I think any one of us, and assuming we all did, went to school, experienced one end or the other of this spectrum.
That's right.
Either we understood something and we were bored and ready to move on to another topic, or something was giving us some trouble and we needed a little bit more time. But you just don't have that flexibility in most classrooms.
That's right.
This page, this project, this amount of time, take it or leave it.
Yep. No, exactly.
I want to go back. We were talking a little bit about non-traditional schedules, and it reminded me of something I think a lot of people learned about you in this book, which is that you started out your career working on not such a traditional schedule on the third shift. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit. I think probably a lot of people don't know this part of your life story about how you started out professionally.
Well, sure. My first job was actually transplanting seedling plants in my uncle's greenhouses when I was in junior high school. It was still junior high, not middle school then. And I had a great time doing that. I got really fast at that. But then the next sort of phase was working in my dad's factory. My dad invented the lighted sun visor. So when you flip the car, the sun visor down on the car and open the little flap and there's lights, that was originally developed by my dad. And it was a privilege to work in the factory and help to build some of those from the very start. But for a couple of summers, I worked the third shift, so 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. and was making. I had the worst job in the plant, known to be the worst job because I was the boss's daughter. So they put me in the least desirable place, taking the plastic core off the injection molding machine, putting a rubber edge band around the end, putting the metal plate in the corner, closing it, and then riveting it about 10 to 12 times. I was really, really thankful. I never did rivet any of my fingers, even though I probably should have during that 11 to 7 shift. But it was a great experience and really made me appreciate the role that entrepreneurship and creativity play in our nation.
Yeah, it's incredible, and I think it's so unfortunate as someone who knows you that probably so many, including some of you joining us on this live stream here today, only know you through the way the media covered you and some of that lovely coverage that you endured over the years. But I think there's so much more to this story, and I hope people are coming to learn that. Hannah from New York in that vein asks, what's one of the favorite things that you do with your family? Well, you're not working on education policy.
Well, I first of all, just love spending time with my family, but we are water people. So we love being on the water virtually anywhere, whether it's on a watercraft or on the beach. And, wherever in the world that we can find water and be on water, we love being together on the water.
That's great. And then another question, now going to your time as Secretary of Education, sticking on the personal theme though, Willie from Texas is curious, what's a favorite memory you have from your 4 years in Washington as Secretary of Education?
Oh, my favorite memory is the great people with whom I was privileged to work, Nate among them. And I really did. I had such a great team that, really we worked together so well at the department. And that's the biggest thing I miss is really the people and working with the people on behalf of the kids of this country.
I know another thing you really enjoyed, I think, not only as secretary, but over your years working on this, is being in schools and being with kids. And that's really one of the things that comes through in this book is the number of really great schools across this country and educational models that are popping up. I wonder if maybe you can share for everybody watching, a couple of the schools that come to mind of really breaking the mold and embracing this student first mentality that you're talking about.
Yes, there were so many great schools that I had opportunity to visit. And one of them that comes to mind is a school that was located, much of the day was located at the zoo in the city. And kids would come there for their classes in the afternoon. And, again, thinking out of the box in terms of where learning happens. Another school that I loved was a little one that we visited in Wyoming, where actually I was really impressed with the whole district because they had made the district-wide system really available to all families to choose the best fit for their children. They were actually exercising a level of education freedom that most districts wouldn't even consider. And the elementary school I visited was one that was, there was no principal. It was teacher run and parent directed. And so it was a real cooperative arrangement. It was a great model, and I could tell, and it was also a blended model. So kids were not in specific grades. They were perhaps in between grades in some subject areas, and they worked with multi-age children. It was a great school. Yeah, there were so many really terrific schools. And of course, one of my favorite schools, which I was not permitted to visit as secretary because it was deemed to be a conflict. I'm not sure why, but my husband started a charter high school that's focused on aviation. And all the kids who come there really learn a lot about the aviation world. But importantly, it's focused on, the STEM subjects. So they get very strong foundations in the science, technology, and math, and it really set them up for whatever their future, whatever their careers guide them into. And a couple of dozen kids graduate each year with their private pilot's license. They have another program where kids are building a whole aircraft from scratch. So these are just examples of different ways of helping kids learn that really unlocks their curiosity and potential, and really should be an inspiration for others as we think about an environment of education freedom. How broadly and how big can we think and dream?
Yeah, how true is that? Those schools I know, and lots of others are in this book, Hostages No More, a national bestseller. For everybody who hasn't had a chance to read it yet, you can go right now to premiercollectibles.com/hostages, premiercollectibles.com/hostages, and get a copy that Betsy will personally sign for you. So you can read about these schools, read about other opportunities, different ways that you can get engaged in the fight to improve education in this country. Several questions coming in, Betsy, about folks who are concerned about what's being taught. But Anna in California is a student in high school and is particularly interested what words or advice you would offer her as someone who disagrees with some of what she's being taught. And I think we've both seen in California, probably, sorry for you, Anna, there are a lot of questionable things that have come up there. Can a student in high school speak up or out against, in a respectful way, some of the curriculum that they're being exposed to?
Well, Anna, I feel for you, and I just encourage you to be emboldened to do raise your voice, not raise it in terms of volume, but please do try to engage and respectfully debate ideas. The ability to speak freely and engage in the whole back and forth around ideas is what learning really is ultimately. And if you do not get a welcome in doing so, I think that's another thing to really help make the case, and for your parents, your family, to make the case that you need to have the freedom to choose a place that is going to encourage that, and is going to support the notion that learning is also inclusive of debating and exchanging ideas, and ultimately forming your beliefs and your opinions in the process of doing so.
Great. We're staying on the theme of advice here. Several questions coming in asking about what teachers might be able to do to help in this. Carly in Missouri, though, is going to be graduating from teaching college here soon to become an elementary teacher. She's curious what words of wisdom you have for her. And some of you on Facebook are also asking, how can teachers help advocate within their own schools for an environment that's more student-centric?
Well, first of all, thank you, teachers, for choosing the profession that you have chosen and for serving kids. And I know all of you who have tuned in and are educators have kids at heart and their interests. And I just encourage you in your buildings to be bold, to find other peers with whom you are in simpatico with, and work with them to really foster an environment that is conducive to personalization and to really helping you be your best. I know that, and I know from experience talking with a number of teachers who have left the profession because they have felt beaten down by the system. The only way that's ultimately going to change is in an environment of freedom, where you as educators have the freedom to go where it works best for you to utilize and exercise your skills and your talents vis-a-vis your students. And so I just want to encourage each of you, and personally on your personal time, to really advocate to have policy change that will support that kind of an environment, because that will be ultimately the best environment for you and your profession.
It's interesting, Betsy, we're talking about how to change education from what it is today to what it could be in the future. And somebody just posted on Facebook something I know you're going to relate to right away. They're pointing out that there's a Florida school, a charter school in Florida, that's using virtual reality headsets to expose kids. And I know this is something you just recently saw yourself firsthand.
I did.
Maybe talk a little bit about that. And also, again, what could this world of education freedom unlock for students who today, and teachers today, are limited by what a single building, maybe in a small community, could even possibly reasonably be expected to offer?
Well, again, I think it's difficult for all of us to wrap our heads around what could be in a matter of a few years if we have an environment of full education freedom. But yes, I had the opportunity to experience this 3D virtual reality learning experience, and it was really exciting. I think it was funny for the folks who are watching me do this, because there's lots of gesturing and hand motions, and if you're not if you don't have the headset on yourself, it is funny to watch someone else, but you feel like you're right there in that setting. And how much more meaningful learning about elements of history can be if you are actually virtually there in that setting. And again, we have not begun to scratch the surface of what that could look like. I just want to go back to Horace Mann, the father of the education system 175 years ago. So interestingly, Horace Mann died 20 years before Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. So Horace Mann never even dreamt of making a telephone call. And you think about that in the context of how communication, how telephone communication, verbal communication has changed since that advent of the first telephone, to where and how easily we communicate with anyone, anywhere in the world today. And yet we are operating our K-12 education system essentially the same way as it was 175 years ago. And so I think that word picture can help set a lot of creativity in motion with folks who really see the possibilities for an education freedom environment.
Yeah, isn't that true? It's even looking at this table here with us. We both have cell phones. We have an iPad. But most importantly, you're on a live stream the world over, sharing via Facebook and other ways ideas that we can change this system, built, designed, implemented, and largely still maintained by someone who never even made a phone call. I mean, you really have to sit back and soak that in to appreciate what we're talking about. Lots of questions, and we only have a little bit time left here, but lots of questions coming in on some current events, Betsy. Maybe we can go through some of these quickly, on top of all the great things that you cover in this great book, Hostages No More. Obviously, you were in the news quite a bit recently, talking about shutting down the department that you and I used to work in Washington. And maybe talk about that, but I'll also talk a little bit. I think people perhaps don't understand what the U.S. Department of Education does or doesn't do, and what you actually mean when you say that we don't need a federal department.
Sure. So just a little history on the Department of Education. The Department of Education was founded in 1979 as a payoff to the teachers' unions who had given their endorsement to Jimmy Carter running for president in 1976. And so it's a relatively new and young department. Where education was dealt with in the federal government at the time, the cabinet secretary of that department, it was HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare, said he did not believe, and he was part of the Carter administration, he did not believe that the federal government should have a federal Department of Education because it would take power away from the states. And states are really where policy and power and the resources come from for education. Most people don't know that only 8 or 9% of funding for education comes from the federal government. But taxpayers send money to the Department of Education. It gets spun around in the department by good and well-meaning people, but then it goes back out to the states and local districts with all kinds of strings attached, and it doesn't add any value to a student's education experience. In fact, since 1979, when the department was founded, we have spent well over $1 trillion at the federal level, and with the express goal of closing the achievement gap. And this was pre-pandemic, not only has the achievement gap not closed one little bit, by many measures, it's actually widened in that amount of time. And so one has to really ask why we should continue to perpetuate spending and then putting all kinds of rules and regulations around that spending and burdening states and local communities and families with that, and not have any real outcome to measure and to claim as a victory. So it was mentioned within the last couple of weeks that I had suggested the abolishment of the department, but that was not a new thing. I have suggested it many times. Somebody just paid attention this time. And we actually had, during our time in office, we had submitted 2 budgets that would have block granted all the money back to the states and essentially done that, made the department not necessary. There are a couple of things that are necessary, but those could be handled by other departments very, very easily.
And let me just ask you, not in the way that Congress used to, but I think some straightforward yes or no questions. Does the U.S. Department of Education run any schools?
No.
Does it have any involvement in teaching?
No.
Does it have any involvement in curriculum?
No.
Does it have any involvement in anything that really impacts a student day in and day out?
No.
So when
and the focus is not on students.
No. So when you say that there shouldn't be a federal department for you at home, it would really have no impact on what's happening to you other than fewer bureaucrats in Washington trying to get in the way and probably more money going into the education in your state.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And fewer regulations. And, we see in the current administration, a lot of overreach into areas that really should be reserved, frankly, to families and certainly to local communities.
Perfect segue. You probably didn't know you were doing it, but several questions coming in about something that department's doing right now, something you touched on in this book, great book, Hostages No More, but is evolving in real time, which is the current administration's proposal around Title IX, which most of us know, as you know, as a law that was really designed to improve opportunities for women and girls, and largely have been known, credited for advancing women's sports. But what this proposal would do is quite a dramatic departure from what Title IX was
very dramatic departure. And what it would do if it's implemented as they are proposing is essentially kill women's sports. This is very, very concerning. The public comment period is open right now. So anybody who's interested in weighing in with public comment, please do. But this notion that you can protect women's sports, but also expand the definition of biological sex to include gender identity and basically anything you decide to be at any given point in time, it will decimate women's sports. And in addition to the fact that their proposal also would undermine all due process protections for those who are accused of misconduct, sexual misconduct.
Yeah, and maybe talk a little bit more about that, because I think that so often gets misconstrued in terms of the work you did. We came out of an environment where it was widely viewed by the courts, by university leaders, by folks involved, that there was no due process, which is a core fundamental value that we hold in justice in this country, that you have the right to know what you're accused of, to confront your accuser, to know the evidence being used against you, to bring forward all the things that any of us who have watched Law and Order, or let alone been involved in one of these proceedings, might know about. You brought those back.
Yes.
Which some people say was tilting the scales. I think you were very clearly balancing the scales.
We were balancing the scales and putting together a framework that was reliable and that put the complainant in charge to decide how they wanted to proceed. And this proposed rule, the changes that they are proposing will really decimate that as well. And it will return us to the kangaroo courts of the previous administration, where actually more than 200 cases were decided in favor of those who had been wronged because they had not been afforded due process. So I don't know how they justify even proposing what they're proposing.
Yeah, it is remarkable to think about this proposal that would allow, I think one of the biggest defects, you probably agree, correct me if not, this idea that a single person, a single investigator at a high school or college campus could be the detective, the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury.
Yeah.
And to think that that's a system that would somehow create fairness or objectivity for anyone.
Yeah, it's inconceivable. It's a horrible rule, a horrible proposal. And I'm very hopeful that folks will engage in the opining against it.
Agreed. So we have just about 5 minutes left here with Betsy DeVos, author of Hostages No More, The Fight for Education Freedom, The Future of the American Child. It's a great book. I think you're going to learn a lot about it, about education in this country, about Betsy, and about how you can get involved in that fight. If you don't have a copy yet, go to premiercollectibles.com/hostages. You can order a personally signed copy. Betsy's going to sign them right here on the table right after we finish up this discussion. Another question, Betsy, that's coming in from those listening into this conversation is about how much of this is becoming reality today. You talked a little bit about the law that passed in Arizona recently, but talk for those who maybe aren't tracking what's happening across the country the way you are. Talk about what many have called the year of school choice that we've just come out of.
So in 2021, 26 states expanded or passed new laws that will afford some measure of education freedom in each of those states. And there are many more states that have introduced legislation this year and that are working on doing just that. There have been many polls taken in the last couple of years around this subject. And the reality is that 3 out of 4 Americans support the notion that the money for students should follow the students. In other words, they support education freedom. And so those who are running for office and elected to office need to know this, and they need to be held to account for those who support this. This is sort of a no-brainer issue, but it is also an issue that has been really held hostage in a major way by those who are have self-interest, those who benefit from the system, from perpetuating this monopolistic government-run system.
And I think for so many, they've really come face to face with those things that hold kids hostage, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe it's the government control of the system. Maybe it was through COVID, the totally unnecessary union-driven lockdowns that extended far longer than anyone thought was necessary. Maybe it's these curriculum issues. Several people on Facebook talking about CRT, critical race theory, and its perniciousness in schools today, or gender theory that we just talked about in Title IX. So many reasons for parents, for families, for grandparents, for concerned members of this country, your communities to get engaged. And I think Cindy from Louisiana, maybe gets at the core of this in a way that brings us back to where we started this discussion, which is what inspired you to read this book now, and why do you think it's so important for people to read this book and really become engaged in these conversations about education?
Well, I think this is a critical moment in our nation's history with regard to education and the future for our kids. I wrote the book because I think that there are many, many ways that families, parents can get involved, and many tools that they have to make their voices heard and to ensure that they will ultimately be able to direct and control their children's education. That's ultimately what needs to happen. And it's become all the more clear in the last 2 years as parents who thought that they had a lot of say over their kids. They may have moved to a district that they thought was going to do a great job, and that particular system failed them. And so this is really an important time for them to continue to be involved, to ensure that the policy changes that are going to support them making those choices and decisions will ultimately happen. And that happens state by state. It also happens in some sense at the federal level, but it importantly happens state by state.
So true. This has been really, I think, hopefully an enlightening discussion for everyone. There were so many questions. We weren't able to keep up with all of them, but I think you'll find the answers to many of them in this tremendous new book, Hostages No More, which if you haven't yet, go to premiercollectibles.com/hostages, order your copy. Betsy's going to start signing them right now for you, and we'll get those in the mail here in no time. I think you're really going to find whether it's K-12 education, whether it's higher education, whether it's issues like Title IX, other civil rights issues, school safety, all of these things and more things that you've tackled in this book.
That's right. That's right.
And I hope that everyone gets that chance to really wrestle with these ideas, debate them, and learn from this book in a way that they'll also hopefully have some fun reading as well.
That's right. I hope you all enjoy it. And thanks so much for joining us this afternoon.
Well, thank you all again for logging in. We're going to start signing some books now. We'll be back here again soon. Thank you all again for making the time. It's been so good to be with you. Thanks for your interest. Hostages No More by Betsy DeVos. Order your copy now. premiercollectibles.com/hostages. Have a great afternoon.
Hey, this is John Acuff, New York Times best-selling author of 7 books and someone who's done a live signing. If you like the one you just watched, make sure you check out our YouTube channel. It's full of amazing authors having great conversations and signing books for viewers just like you. So make sure you subscribe, and thanks for watching today.